The Detroit Lions are putting the finishing touches on their final roster. And with that in mind, let's talk about some of my biggest takeaways to come away from how the Lions decided to approach this roster construction. What's going on, Lions fans? Miko here with Pride of Detroit. And in today's video, we are going to take a look at how the Lions decided to build their 2023 roster and some of the bigger takeaways that I had from what decisions the Lions decided to make. Specifically, looking at just a couple high level things and not necessarily going position group by position group. Because let's be honest, the last video I did when doing that ended up being almost over 20 minutes. And so, to keep this video from being that long, I'm just going to take a look at 6 things that really stood out to me from what the Lions decided to do with this roster and what I think that could lead to once the regular season gets here next week when the Lions take on the Kansas City Chiefs. So, without further rambling on and without wasting too much more time, let's get into some of the things that really stood out to me with how the Lions decided to approach this year's roster. Now, if we're going to talk big takeaways, we got to start for me on the defensive side of the football. Now, if you guys checked out my video where I did a roster prediction on this channel, you will have known that I did lean heavier on the defensive side of the football. But most of the players that I was talking about the Lions going heavy at were primarily in the secondary and potentially on the defensive tackle position. Well, in the Lions' final roster, they did go heavy on the defensive side, but specifically, they went much heavier on the D line than I necessarily thought they would, as they decided to go with 7 edge rushers and 5 defensive tackles, essentially deciding not to get rid of any of their edge players and keeping the 5 defensive tackles that I assumed that the Lions would keep in Aleem McNeil, Isaiah Buggs, Benito Jones, Broderick Martin, and yes, Levi Onwuzurike also made this roster, which in itself is something to celebrate for Levi, considering where he was last year, considering where he was at OTAs and minicamp with that back injury, and to be able to put together a very impressive preseason and training camp to earn himself a spot on this roster. So, amongst the people on this defensive line, Levi is the one that I'm the happiest for, and the one that I kind of really can't wait to see get into the regular season and see how much he's utilized and how well his body holds up and what that could actually lead to from a production standpoint. But when we look at the edge rusher spot, this was a group that many of us thought that the Lions would probably only keep 6, maybe even 5 players at, and the Lions essentially just decided to keep everybody. And not gonna lie, that's a little surprising because considering the fact that the Lions, specifically looking at like Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn, they really did talk a lot about those guys near the bottom, or at least guys competing at the bottom, in regards to James Houston, Julian Okwara, Romeo Okwara, and what those guys would have to do to really earn a spot. And the fact that, like, let's just be honest with it, the fact that Julian made it is a big surprise to me. Now, we do know that as of today, he has been moved over to IR, and that has allowed the Lions to do some more finagling with the roster, which we'll talk about a little later in this video. But I can't lie, I was very surprised that Julian made it because outside of his really impressive game against the Giants, and yes, having some splash plays here and there in training camp, I wasn't really sure that Julian did just enough to make this roster. But with the Lions deciding to keep him, it basically tells me that what those flashes that they see, the flashes that Aaron Glenn talked about, that Dan Campbell talked about, those flashes are bright enough to where they're not ready to give up on this player. Now, the thing that is unfortunate though is that he has to start the year on IR. And so once again, that potential, that development is slowed by him just not being available come week 1. However, it does once again lend itself to the idea that you really can't have enough pass rushers. The Lions now having 7 of those guys, and all 7 aren't going to dress, but you at least now have depth to where if you sustain injuries like you did last year with a couple players, you know you have plenty of bodies that you can rotate in and that can play a number of different positions. The same with the defensive tackle position. I'm not sure if all 5 guys will dress every single Sunday, but you know that you at least have some depth behind Aleem and behind Isaiah Buggs so that they don't have to play ridiculous snap counts. And that in itself, both with the edges and with the defensive tackle spots, should allow your defense to be fresher and allow them to play at a higher level for a longer period of time. So that whether it's the first quarter or the fourth quarter, you're still able to get high level of play from your defensive line. Now, onto the second thing that really stood out to me with this roster, it has to be the return of Emmanuel Mosley. And not just the fact of him returning to the roster, but the impact that it had on what decisions the Lions decided to make at the cornerback position. Again, going back to my prediction, I wasn't really sure that Emmanuel Mosley was going to be ready come week one, and I thought he would still be on the pup list probably through the first couple weeks of the season, as we weren't getting a lot of updates as far as him being close to returning to the field. So the fact that not only did the Lions take him off the pup list, but it caused them to take up a roster spot, it immediately has this domino effect of, okay, well, now one of these corners has to be out. Because again, some of the decisions that I made when looking at how I thought the Lions would address the roster had to keep in mind that one of these guys was going to have to be let go once Emmanuel Mosley was healthy. Well, that day just came sooner than I expected, probably sooner than a lot of other fans expected. And what that basically translated to was that guys like Starling Thomas and Chase Lucas, who probably did enough throughout camp and throughout the preseason to make you think that they could earn a spot, immediately found themselves on the outside looking in because Emmanuel Mosley was absolutely going to get a spot on this roster. Now it's all about getting him healthy. It's all about seeing how quickly he can get conditioned so that he can join the team and be ready to play on Sundays. Like I said in the video that I released earlier this week, I don't expect him to play next week against the Chiefs. It just seems a little too soon to expect him to play a high snap count, at least on defense. Now, there's always the possibility that they sneak him in on some special teams plays just to get the cardio going, just to have him run up and down the field and, kind of get that feeling back in his body of what it's like to make live tackles and play football. But as far as expecting him to line up on the outside or even necessarily challenge Jerry Jacobs for that cornerback two spot, I think we're probably about a good 2 to 3 weeks out from that being a realistic thing. But once Emmanuel Mosley is healthy, that tandem of him, Jerry Jacobs, and Cam Sutton is going to be something that's very interesting to watch because a secondary that already seemed very versatile is about to become even more so with the addition of Mosley. So moving on to the third takeaway that I had from how the Lions decided to build this roster, it's something that I wasn't necessarily thrilled about and not something that I predicted, but it does kind of make sense if you look at it from the Lions perspective. And that's the fact that they decided to go with Matt Nelson as the third offensive tackle over the likes of Jermaine Ifedi. Now, again, if you've watched any of the videos that I've been doing the last few weeks, you know that I've been very high on Jermaine Ifedi, and I thought he had done enough to prove to be a more viable offensive tackle option over the likes of Matt Nelson and showed the same level of versatility to be able to play on the left and right side. However, if I take a step back and don't focus so much so on the Giants game, Matt Nelson did clean up his act throughout the rest of the preseason, specifically looking at the Jaguars game and looking at that Carolina game. He wasn't an issue. He wasn't the sore thumb that was kind of standing out and being the domino that was trickling down and causing that offensive line to fail. It was a bad game. And based off of what the Lions probably saw both in training camp and throughout the rest of the preseason, that gave them enough confidence that Matt Nelson, who was more familiar with this offense as a player that they know how to utilize, would be a better fit for them rather than going with Jermaine Ifedi, who again was playing well in his own right and actually playing so well that he earned himself a roster spot with the Buffalo Bills. It just was like clearly a sign of like how close these two players were throughout camp. And Dan Campbell even hinted as much when pressed about what the race looked like between Nelson and Ifedi. And he gave us the clue that, like, hey, they're close. Sometimes Dan Campbell tells the truth. Sometimes he may be leading us astray a little bit. But in this instance, he was clearly very much sold on what Matt Nelson was doing, both in practice and on training camp, to feel confident that, you know what, if something were to happen with Taylor Decker or Penei Sewell during the season, he feels more than confident that Matt Nelson can step in and do an admirable job on that offensive tackle spot. Now, it's also worth keeping in mind that the Lions did keep Connor Galvin on the practice squad as well, who was another offensive tackle that was playing relatively well. Unfortunately, he was mostly playing with the third team, but they do have another developmental tackle that they can kind of work with throughout the regular season. And maybe by next year, he's a more viable option for that offensive tackle three spot, or he can push the Lions to keep a fourth offensive tackle come next year. Now, onto the fourth biggest takeaway that I had from this roster and how it's currently built is the fact that Craig Reynolds was somebody that I expected to make this roster fairly easily as the third running back, as the person who never really seemed threatened or challenged when he was available and was able to play. And to the Lions' credit, Craig did make the roster. He is now, as of today, on the roster with the Lions putting Julian Okwara on IR. I just didn't expect it to be a late addition and require some IR, shuffling in order to get Craig onto the roster. Now, Jeremy and Eric and the guys have done an amazing job of explaining why this is likely the case and why they went this route rather than making a cut somewhere else. And it largely has to do with the fact that Craig Reynolds is a veteran and there's more opportunities to just be able to cut him outright, have a deal in place on the side that brings him back and gets him a new contract and still allows you to retain a player rather than risk losing that player by simply waiving them like they did with some of the other players on this roster. So Craig Reynolds making the roster, not a surprise at all. He's a viable third running back for this Lions team, and he showed once again throughout the preseason, especially in that Carolina game, that he can do just about anything the Lions ask him to do. And like we've always kind of talked about when it came to Craig Reynolds, it's maybe not at the highest level. It's probably not at the same clip as a David Montgomery or a Jameer Gibbs, but he can still be viable in both the run and pass game. And that's something that you really want in the event that either of those other two running backs goes down. Craig Reynolds is the type of back that just meshes well with this offense and does what this offense needs him to do when he's called upon. And again, he's one of those guys that you can have active and he can get a couple touches here and there to help keep both Demo and Ja healthy and fresh throughout the game. So, with that wrapped up, we're now heading into the fifth thing that really stood out to me when it comes to this Lions roster. And for me, it's what the Lions did with their UDFAs. If you all remember, leading into both OTAs and minicamp, and definitely into training camp, there was a good amount of buzz about some of these UDFAs that the Lions had retained and picked up after the draft, specifically looking at Mohamed Ibrahim, Starling Thomas V, Dylan Drummond, and even Stephen Gilmore, along with a couple other guys here and there. Chase Cota showed up once the preseason games kind of kicked off. There was a good amount of buzz about, like, hey, some of these UDFAs really might make a push for this roster. And that even had me rethink my original stance, where I didn't think a single UDFA would make this team just because I thought the Lions had upgraded their roster well enough across the board. But by the time we got close to the end of the preseason, I had the Lions keeping at least three UDFAs on this roster in the likes of Dylan Drummond, in the likes of Starling Thomas, and Stephen Gilmore. Well, fast forward to today, and Stephen Gilmore is the only UDFA that the Lions decided to retain from this most recent UDFA class. Now, Dylan Drummond was able to bounce over to the practice squad, which is a great sign for the Lions. But the likes of Chase Cota and Starling Thomas were not nearly as fortunate. Starling Thomas was picked up by the Arizona Cardinals, which is a great opportunity for him. And it's going to be really cool to see how his career progresses over in Arizona. Meanwhile, Chase Cota was unfortunately dealing with some sort of injury and had to be waived with an injury settlement. But when looking at Stephen Gilmore, I think it's pretty safe to say that when watching how he progressed throughout training camp and how he performed in these preseason games, he showed the ability to make the most of his opportunities and kind of have the mentality that I think the Lions really valued in having a developmental corner. He showed the ability to make plays. He showed the ability to not allow moments to be too big for him and to be able to bounce back. That's a lot of just intangibles that you can kind of work with and mold. And as you start to improve his technique over the season and over, throughout the rest of the year, looking ahead to next season, he could develop into a very sound corner for this team. Now, while I was initially shocked that Starling Thomas didn't make this roster, when you start to compare him against the likes of Stephen Gilmore and what the likes of even Khalil Dorsey was bringing when looking at special teams, I can see that, and I assume that the Lions would have loved to have brought Sterling Thomas back and helped develop him on the practice squad, but he just wasn't doing nearly enough in the games and probably didn't have like the longevity and the consistency that the likes of Stephen Gilmore had throughout training camp practices as well. Again, Starling Thomas definitely flashed. He definitely had signs. He definitely had the intangibles as far as like the physical traits and the feistiness that the Lions probably would have really coveted in a corner that they would have liked to have developed as well. But for one, they didn't get the chance to put him on the practice squad. And two, Stephen Gilmore was just that much better. And with going back to the number two thing that was on my list, I'm pretty sure Emmanuel Mosley coming back from the pup list really impacted their ability to be able to keep Starling Thomas and thus have to roll the dice on him trying to make it through the waiver wire. But it's not the end of the world because, again, the Lions still have a young corner that they get to develop and mold in Stephen Gilmore. And lastly, when talking about Dylan Drummond, I'm not going to lie. I'm a little surprised the Lions only decided to go with 5 wide receivers. I definitely felt very confident that Dylan Drummond did enough, especially near the end, to be able to make this roster. But Eric Schlitt made a very good point when talking about the fact that due to the fact that Dylan Drummond was primarily going to probably play in the slot once the regular season came in, do you really need 3 slot wide receivers when looking at the likes of Amon-Ra St. Brown, Khalif Raymond, and then having a Dylan Drummond that probably wouldn't dress most Sundays because you are already set at that wide receiver spot? Not to mention the likes of Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta can also line up in the slot when asked. Again, fortunately, the Lions were able to keep Drummond on the practice squad, and I think he's going to be somebody that's worth watching next year to see how much he improves. And just an early guess right now, and I might end up eating these words later. I don't think we're looking at the next Tom Kennedy. I do think Dylan Drummond can definitely continue to improve his game and progress and make an even stronger push to make this roster come next year. And last but not least, my final takeaway from looking at this Lions roster is what they decided to do at the kicker position. Now, I had a strong feeling that this was Riley Patterson's job to lose, and it definitely looked like he might have lost it when looking at his performance in that Carolina game. But Dan Campbell kind of brushed off that performance after the game, saying that he pretty much chalked it up to a bad day and really praised Riley for having a strong camp and being consistent, or his version of consistent, throughout training camp and earlier in the preseason prior to that game. And that has at least been enough to earn Riley Patterson a spot as of right now. However, the Lions didn't just settle with having Riley Patterson on the roster. They did go out and pick up Michael Badgley and return him back to the Lions, but this time on the practice squad, which basically gives you a hint that this kicker competition is still going to continue. Now, the question though becomes, Riley Patterson didn't win this competition the last time, and Michael Badgley was somebody that they thought was very similar to Riley Patterson. I don't know what they're necessarily expecting to get out of these two, other than probably have an option in the event that Riley struggles. But going into the regular season, kicking is going to be important. And we know at this point in time that Riley Patterson doesn't have the biggest leg, but neither does Michael Badgley. And so I do think that's going to at least have an impact on how the Lions and how Dan Campbell chooses to coach this team, especially when it comes down to taking points versus going for it on fourth down. We all know that Dan Campbell isn't afraid to roll the dice. It might be fair to say that he might be rolling the dice a little more often if he doesn't feel super confident that he has a kicker that can kick from distance. But guys, that's going to do it for my biggest takeaways from the Lions roster. Let me know in the comment section below, what do you think of the Lions roster? Is there any big takeaways that you had, especially now that they're starting to iron out the practice squad, now that we're seeing guys be put on IR, and maybe possibly even seeing a couple guys cut for other players that are made available? What do you think is still left for the Lions to do on this roster? And like I said, is there anything that really surprised you? Is there a big takeaway that you have? And how do you feel about the team going into the season now that you have a general idea of what this roster is going to look like? Also, if you're looking for more information on the Detroit Lions, you already know you can head over to prideofdetroit.com and check out all the latest articles and news that's being posted on our website daily. And last but not least, if you are new to this channel, if you've never subscribed to Pride of Detroit before, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to hit that notification bell. That way you can be notified anytime we launch a brand new video here on our YouTube channel. Once again, everybody, I'm Miko here at Pride of Detroit. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.